Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which definitely count. Welcome to the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe. Today, we're going to be doing something a little bit different. Today, I, Dapper Dan Gavosden, am going to be talking about the brand new Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales game for the PlayStation 5 with my friend and podcaster Dave Chen. You might know Dave from one of his many popular podcasts, including the Slashfilmcast and the Tobolowsky Files. Dave invited me to join him for a conversation on his personal pop culture show, Culturally Relevant, for a review of the new video game, and so that's what you'll hear here. I hope that if you enjoy this conversation, you'll consider checking out the Culturally Relevant show, as it is an excellent place for interviews and discussions about our culture and how we engage with it. As for this conversation, we start with a spoiler-free section at the beginning and transition into a spoiler-filled discussion, but with plenty of warning for those of you who don't want the game's plot spoiled for you. So now, I hope you enjoy our conversation about Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales on the PlayStation 5.
What's new? It's Spider-Man, so everybody is it blue? Maybe he took a week off cause he had the flu, but probably not cause his methods seem tried and true. Let's find out in the Spider-Man review.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Culturally Relevant, a podcast about film, television, art, and culture. I'm David Chen, and welcome to a bonus episode. You know, usually on the podcast, quite often we talk about serious things, important things. Today, we're going to lighten it up a bit. We're going to talk about video games, and specifically a brand new video game that's just been released for the PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5 consoles, which is called Spider-Man Miles Morales. It's a video game based on the Miles Morales character. It's kind of the sequel-ish follow-up to the PlayStation 4's hugely successful Spider-Man game, which was great fun and also sold extremely well. I was really excited to play it. I just finished it this week, as did my guest today, who is joining me to discuss it. Dan Gavosden hosts the Amazing Spider Talk podcast. He has forgotten more about Spider-Man than I will ever know. Dan Gavosden, thanks for joining me today on Culturally Relevant.
Yeah, thanks for having me, David. I've been really enjoying your serious topic shows, your quarantine diaries and things like that. And I feel like while this might not be a serious topic, it does fit into that quarantine diaries thing because considering how fast we beat this game, it's probably mostly what we've been doing.
Indeed. So anyway, before we start, just a couple quick call-outs. First of all, you can find more episodes of this podcast at culturallyrelevantshow.com. Email me at culturallyrelevantshow@gmail.com. And thanks to all of my patrons at patreon.com/Dave Chen for supporting this podcast. Also, Dan, are we going to cross-post this? We're going to get some cross-posting action going?
Yeah, I think that sounds fun. So if you want to hear this again, if you're hearing this on Culturally Relevant, which, I mean, why not? Give it a double download. Head on over to my show, The Amazing Spider Talk. It's all about Spider-Man in every form you can imagine. So, that's I'm sure I'll talk about it later. But, go check it out over there.
Yeah, check out Dan's podcast. Definitely a great listen if you are into Spider-Man or comics in general. And I should also point out that we will start by talking about general thoughts on the game and other things like that, and then we're going to move on into spoilers for the game because we both beat it and we want to talk about it. But I guess here's a question, Dan, that we might want to start with. I assume most people that saw the title of this episode come up on the podcast feed, for Culturally Relevant at least, that it was going to be a review of Miles Morales, the Spider-Man game, probably are like, that doesn't interest me. I'm just not going to download it or listen to this. But if for some reason someone has made it this far into the podcast and has no idea what Spider-Man Miles Morales is or why they should care, do you have any thoughts on why someone should care about Spider-Man Miles Morales if they have no idea about any of this stuff?
Well, I mean, I think there's probably a number of avenues you could go down, both like
Yes.
cultural and like tech related would be
Why don't
maybe
you
the
Why don't you take the cultural? I'll take the tech. How about that?
sure. So I mean, culturally, Miles Morales is kind of this. I mean, if you haven't heard of this game, then surely you've heard of Into the Spider Verse, and maybe you've just heard of the
Yes, the
character.
Academy Award winning Spider-Man
Yes.
film Into the Spider-Verse. Yep.
Yes, of which I was happy to join you on the Slashfilmcast to talk about. But Miles kind of holds a special place in comics history, not as like the first biracial superhero or even the first Black or Puerto Rican superhero, but the first of that in the realm of Spider-Man, which I guess is like a niche upon a niche. Um, but he kind of sees the pop culture zeitgeist over a decade ago and has kind of found himself as this major Spider-Man figure. I mean, I can't think of a superhero that went from page to movie screen to Academy Award quite as quickly as Miles Morales has, and he's really kind of in terms of popularity, found himself like sitting comfortably alongside a cultural juggernaut like Peter Parker in a very short period of time. And so in that regard, I think that this game is like a further reflection of that. I mean, even just having a video game of Miles Morales is really kind of hard to conceive of. Just in that there aren't many superhero video games generally, or especially of this caliber, and kind of representing this character. And I think this game really leans into how special, that is, culturally and in terms of just kind of like pure pop culture significance. You've got like Black Lives Matter murals and a lot of like really interesting characters that represent, a really different side of protagonists that you might not normally see in AAA video games.
Yeah. So I don't know that much about Miles Morales as a character separate from the video game. So I'm curious, like, in the video game, you find out really quickly like he has special powers that Peter Parker doesn't have, and also separately that he's kind of perceived as the also ran second stringer Spider-Man compared to
Mhm.
Peter Parker. Like Peter Parker and Miles Morales exist in the same universe and they know each other and they're friends. And Peter Parker's kind of training Miles Morales in this video game. And he's considered like this kind of also ran Spider-Man that must prove himself to become as beloved as Spider-Man Prime. Is that kind of the dynamic in the comic books as well, or does the video game depart from that? And if so, if it is a departure, like what is it about Miles Morales that's special in the comic books, other than the fact that he is a biracial Spider-Man?
Sure. What's interesting about Miles Morales is kind of every different iteration of the character has like almost a wildly different origin story. Well, not maybe not wildly different, but quite different from each other. Whereas
Every
with
iteration of Miles Morales in the comic books, you're saying?
well, no,
Or
I mean like the comics, the movie, and this game.
I see. Yeah.
And I think it's because his comic origins are a little more complicated than say the standard origin story. So Miles Morales debuted not in the regular Marvel Prime universe. There was this imprint of comics in the late '90s called the Ultimate Comics that started with Ultimate Spider-Man, written by Miles's co-creator Brian Michael Bendis. And it was kind of a way to, in the late '90s, Marvel was filing for bankruptcy, and their comics weren't selling very well. And there's a whole story behind that I won't get into. But they wanted to attract new readers who maybe were turned off by daunting decades of continuity, and so they launched this Ultimate line with the Spider-Man book that basically took Peter back to high school and retold his origin stories in like with a modern lens. And that book ran for about 10 years, and Peter went from becoming a sophomore in high school to a junior in high school. But around exactly the 160th issue, they did a story called The Death of Spider-Man. And in that issue, Peter Parker is murdered by the Green Goblin saving his family. And a few issues later, Miles Morales was introduced and had been teased for quite some time. And his origin in that universe is that he got bit by a different spider. As you saw in the Into the Spider-Verse movie, this kind of like spider with a 42 on the back of it. And was actually around on the scene when Peter was killed and was so scared he didn't do anything. And Miles is like 13 in the comics, which is like no other iteration really has him that young, and I think for good reason. And so Peter Parker, the whole idea is really that Peter Parker will become his Uncle Ben figure. You know, he could have stepped in and done something, and yet out of fear or I mean, I guess in Peter's case, it's not necessarily fear, but you get the idea is that like, this is a thing. Peter, his legacy continues on in Miles, who has to, you know, through his inaction, live up to the mantle of Spider-Man. And then I won't go too much further into the weeds of this, but there was a big story in the comics called Secret Wars that basically ended the multiverse in Marvel Comics for about a week because nothing is ever permanent. And that Ultimate Universe was folded into the regular universe. And the one real consistent change is that Miles found himself in the comics universe with the normal Peter Parker that people have been reading for 50 plus years. So the continuity is now that Miles and Peter coexist. And if you ask me, I think it actually has made Miles a weaker character because I felt like he was stronger on his own when he was living up to the mantle of Peter Parker. Mm-hmm. And now that he's just like coexisting alongside Peter, he does kind of feel like a second run Spider-Man, which I think kind of cheapened the character. Into the Spider-Verse kind of reworked a lot of that and really made, I think, Miles into a stronger character, more unique. You know, I think not written by Brian Michael Bendis, who kind of, I think, tended to write Peter and Miles very similarly to each other. And then this game has taken it even, you know, further afield, that Miles is inspired by his police officer father who dies. That's not in the comics at all. That's all crafted for this particular universe.
Interesting.
So they're all quite different. And I think, you know, first of all, the comics thing that I just went through for a few minutes there is way too complicated to just lay out for any normal person. So I do feel like all of these new iterations are a way of kind of like figuring out, you know, how to, you know, present Miles in a whatever way they feel fit. And it's actually made him, I think, kind of flexible, right? You can use him for whatever theme you want to pursue.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear like the different takes on Miles Morales. Do you have a favorite one between the comics, the Into the Spider-Verse, or the video game? Like in terms of which version of Miles Morales you prefer?
I think Into the Spider-Verse is the richest interpretation.
It's pretty good.
I also think it's the best Spider-Man movie, as I said on your show. So I'm very partial to that, that interpretation.
No, fair enough. Well, thanks for sharing that. That's interesting to reflect on. And I would say that the Miles Morales in the PlayStation video game it's like a fairly straightforward rendition of the character. I would say Into the Spider-Verse is not a straightforward one because of you have like the multiverse and everything like that. But it's Miles Morales in the video game is. He gets bit by a spider. He kind of connects with Peter, and Peter kind of trains him up. And then, Peter is finally taking a vacation after all these years, which, by the way, happens to coincide with some pretty big crises that happen in New York City during the time of the video game. So it just gives Miles Morales some time to come into his own as the new Spider-Man.
I do like that Peter gives him like a long leash, like it just inherently that he trusts him. I thought was quite meaningful in this version of the game. And if I may say one last thing about the differences between the different characters, in the comics, Miles is kind of written a lot like Peter. He's like this kind of smart tech guy, the same way that he is in this game. And, a lot of people complained that like he really wasn't that distinctly different than Peter, which is why I like the Into the Spider-Verse one, where they don't really try to smart him up at all, if you will. He's got different interests than Peter. He's into music and graffiti and art. and stuff like that. And I thought, it was a little bit
It feels like
richer.
maybe the video
Yeah.
game split the difference a little bit. Would you
A
say?
little
Like,
bit, yeah.
But he's very clearly into STEM in the video game, right? He's
Correct,
very
yeah.
very clearly into like tech things and yeah. So a bit of context before we even dive into this game, which is when Spider-Man the video game came out a few years ago. It was pretty revolutionary, maybe is too strong of a word, but like it was a big deal. And the reason it was a big deal is most video games based off of comic book characters or movies are trash, right? Like historically, they are very, very bad. If you look at for examples, I'll just throw out a couple examples. Fight Club, the movie, the video game, terrible. The Sopranos video game for PlayStation 2, I think it was, like awful. Like there's just been a history of really terrible video games being released in the wake of extremely popular and beloved TV shows and movies. They were generally viewed as kind of a cash grab. Like, oh hey, we're marketing this movie, and we as a video game company need to like ride that wave of marketing. Right.
Even more directly, like in the Spider-Man line of games, the past few games predating that were ones that you always felt like they had to meet the release date of the movie. So they were rushed through production to meet that date. And so you got these two amazing Spider-Man games, which had some good ideas, but were just super rough around the edges when games that preceded them were quite good and really made the Spider-Man series stand apart.
But then I think it's right. Insomniac came out with Spider-Man few years ago, and specifically 2018, and it was awesome. It delivered on every front. First of all, I actually restarted that game the other day. I have the remaster on PlayStation 5, and I restarted it again, and within 2 minutes of playing, you're starting to swing through New York City, and it's like press R2 to swing through New York City, and they're teaching you how to swing through New York City, and it is a lot of fun. And that's the thing, is like there's very few games where getting around is its own like really fun activity. Arguably, like you could say maybe Grand Theft Auto is another example of this, right? But like this game is a blast to just go from place to place. And they nailed it. They nailed the transportation of like Spider-Man swinging around the city, how fun and exhilarating that is. Layered on top of that, a brilliant score, and also a great Spider-Man story that kind of honors what we know and understand about Spider-Man. Probably has a bunch of nods to the comic book, renditions of these characters, but is very accessible for people who might not know anything about Spider-Man, like myself, heathens such as myself. I had a great time.
You get a pass, David.
I had a great time with the Spider-Man game a couple years ago, and I assume you feel the same way, Dan. Is that right?
Yeah, I thought it was really fabulous. I mean, you said kind of the thing I think that stands most apart for me is that there's just kind of this like flow you get into, or this groove you can get into, just going around the city, doing small errands, or just swinging through buildings. That there's nothing really quite like. As a gamer myself, my taste tends towards not open world games, typically because I find the traversal so cumbersome or boring, or that it has so many systems and maybe one or two of them are fun, but most of them don't get enough attention to truly be fun. But you really felt in this game like you were Spider-Man. I know that sounds really like a marketing line, Big V Spider-Man, but like every aspect of it worked. Like there was no part of his power set that didn't feel natural to the character that you were playing. And if you think about Spider-Man, I mean, it's not really the easiest character to translate to games. Even you're just mentioning crawling on the ceiling to suddenly being on the floor or whatever. And so just kind of like putting it in a package where everything just worked immediately, I think was just the major success. And that success obviously carries over into the Miles Morales game.
Yeah, so it was great. I should also mention the combat in the Spider-Man game is also really fun. You know, like you're chaining combos together, you're using cool powers, you're using cool Peter Parker gadgets. It was a blast. It was a blast. So then Spider-Man Miles Morales comes out. It's for PlayStation 4 and PlayStation 5. You and I are both lucky enough to have a PlayStation 5. So we
Yes.
played it on this system. And I really had a great time with it. There's a few things that I felt like were a reason why this is like a great way to inaugurate the new generation of consoles. First of all, it looks incredible, but not only that, the performance is amazing as well. You start up the game, and within 10 seconds, you are in the world. And it's just like, wow. I said this on the Slashfilmcast as well, but I felt like I've wasted so much of my life looking at loading screens. And that's what this game makes you realize on the PlayStation 5 is because it's all solid state hard drives now. It loads so quickly. It's amazing to play. And there's cool, ray tracing effects if you want them. But let me ask you this question. Are you a performance guy or are you a fidelity guy, Dan Gvosden? Because basically PlayStation 5, like they make you choose between whether you want to see cooler effects and reflections or whether you want 60 frames per second.
I don't want to commit to which side of the war I'm going to be on just yet. With Miles, I'm a fidelity guy.
Wow.
I cannot play the performance mode on this. I just find it so ugly.
Oh my gosh.
That's
fascinating.
I don't mean like, oh, the ray tracing is slightly diminished. The speed of the 60 frames per second is just garish to my eyes.
It's so fascinating. For me, I played 99.9% of this game in performance mode. I am like, I am now, 60 FPS, 60 frames per second for me is now like HD was for me. Like I can't go back to non 60 frames per second anymore. That's how bad it is for me.
I wonder if I just need to get acclimated to it. I mean, it could just be like, I mean, you watch a lot of movies, so I'm not going to say that like it's my movie watching.
It could just be because I'm more of a movie buff than you, perhaps.
Yeah. I'm not going to claim that, but like there's just something about it just is, it feels like the Hobbit movies in the kind of fast, there's just something about it that seems unnatural to me. But then I've got Demon Souls and I'm a performance mode guy in that game. So like I'm like I said, I don't want to choose a side on that, but I didn't feel like I needed the extra speed in Miles because I didn't feel like it tested my reflexes like in quite the same way. I think it's pretty forgiving. But I don't know. I mean, I just turned it on. I was doing a Twitch stream of it the other night, and within minutes I was like, I can't keep doing this. I just find it so garish. Yeah.
Well, let's hear about so I had a great time with the game. I think I spent 15 hours on it. It's a fairly short campaign compared to Spider-Man. Loved the game and just thoroughly enjoyed the experience of playing it on the PlayStation 5 and thought it was a great way to kick off this new generation of consoles. I think you were a little bit more mixed on it. So tell me about your thoughts on the overall game experience for you.
Yeah, well, I want to couch my thoughts in saying like everything that you thought was great about the last Spider-Man game is still great here, right? Like so when I say like I didn't love certain aspects of it, it's like, well, not every petal on this rose was perfect, or whatever weird strained metaphor you want to go with, but for me it was like there's both a joy in more of the same and kind of a feeling of repetition that settled in for me with this game. I think largely my hesitancy to like scream from the rafters or whatever about this is that you kind of start back at page 1 at the beginning of the game for everybody to jump on board. And I felt like the gameplay itself didn't introduce enough new things in it for me to feel new. I felt like I was doing actions that I had already done in the previous game ad nauseum. Villains were very much the same. Miles handles almost identically to Peter. He's kind of like I know he's less gadget oriented than Peter is, but his Venom moves replicate a lot of those gadgets that Peter had. I just felt like I was playing the same guy as before, and and that was a little disappointing to me because I thought like uh, even if Miles himself wasn't built completely differently than Peter was, I wanted the gameplay to reflect that difference a little bit more. I feel like we get a lot of these new powers of Miles, and we meet new people, but the levels felt like they did the last time. I was never asked to use camouflage to sneak through a scenario where I was like forced to use it. The Venom Blast thing felt like, okay, I need to turn on this button, but instead of pushing the button, I'll use a blast. I didn't feel like the gameplay like took advantage of these new ideas and did anything with them. And then in between that, you're just slowly ramping up the difficulty by adding a new villain type in every level. And the environments are the same. It's always an empty room of some kind with guys in it that populate it. Whereas I felt like in the last game, we had interesting scenarios like the level where you're controlling MJ and you have to call Spider-Man down from the ceiling, or things that just twisted the gameplay up a little bit and kept it
Interesting.
fresh.
I didn't like any of those things that you're describing. Like those other things. Like whenever we were not playing as Peter Parker in the last game, I was like, when am I going to get back to playing as Peter Parker?
Oh, I agree with that. I just kind of meant like something to kind of like change up the perspective or the task that you were doing. I felt like I was endlessly beating up on goons in this game.
Did you do any of the side quests by any
I
chance?
did. I did a lot of them. I think I'm at like a 90% completion.
Oh yeah. So
in the game,
I mean, I think overall, I agree with you that there's not much new introduced in the game, right? Like he handles very similarly than Peter Parker. One thing that's interesting is he looks different, right? And his movements are different. He's a very slender dude, and also like he is less sure of himself because he's still learning how to be Spider-Man. Like when you see it in all his kind of mannerisms and his little movements. And I thought that was interesting. I thought they tried to visually distinguish him. But I agree with you overall. There's not much new in terms of gameplay. I did like that they stripped out the kind of, in my opinion, boring parts when you're not playing as the person as Spider-Man. Like I kind of didn't like those in the first game, and I appreciated that they were gone in this game. But overall, yeah, you're right that it's the gameplay is largely the same. I guess I just appreciated the same gameplay with a fresh coat of paint and also like just really awesome performance, and it felt like playing a different game almost than the first one completely. And so I still had a great time with it. Let's talk about some of the story elements of it. Now, we're not going to spoil anything quite yet, but one thing I thought was really interesting was, I don't know if you saw this article over at Gizmodo about Spider-Man, like this game's relationship with the police. It's by Charles Pulliam Moore, and the headline is Miles Morales reforms Spider-Man's relationship with the police when it needs to be abolished. Did you see this piece by any chance, Dan?
No, but I had seen a lot of the think pieces about the relationship with the police from the previous game. And I was kind of waiting to finish this game before I really kind of thought about how I felt about that. Because there's actually a lot of side missions that deal with the police and firefighters and things like that. Not that those two are in the same camp as each other, but I kind of wanted to see how all those pieces fit together, because in the last game, a lot of the stuff with the police was also relegated to side quests. So I wanted to have like a full understanding of the game before I really went into the think piece territory. But talk to me about it. I'd love to hear about this.
Well, let me preamble this by saying that I think a lot of people react poorly to pieces like this in ways that I don't appreciate. Like I think that if we think video games and their stories are important and are art, which I do, then we should take art seriously, and we should talk about it as though it's art and take the ideas that it puts out seriously. And I think a lot of people are threatened by pieces like this, because what they see when they read a piece like this is the thing that you love or the thing that you're having fun with is bad and you should feel bad. I think like when I see the Twitter reaction to pieces like this, that's what I think it is. And I don't think that is a productive reaction. I think that like, hey, let's just because you're saying like a video game like this is kind of putting forward a specific idea, it doesn't mean you're a bad person for liking the video game or anything like that. We're just trying to see, if we look deep, what this game is trying to say about police. And so I just, start with that preamble.
Yeah, sure. I
And
mean, I think with video games, it's tough because there's no like, especially now, there's not like renting a video game. You're kind of all in or you're not. And it kind of
Right.
creates this like
this
my
culture
camp versus
fandom.
your camp.
Yeah,
thing,
exactly. And I'm just like, I mean, I don't know about your podcast, if people are going to be listening to this episode on your podcast, but like probably I've already scared off, from my podcast and my fandom, most people that would be threatened by something like that. So, but it does make me sad when I see people read a piece like this and say like, how dare this person put this opinion forward? Now, I read this piece. I do not agree with a good portion of it. But I do think it raises some really interesting points, and I'll link to this in the show the piece in the show notes. But as far as I can tell, right, what the piece is trying to say is that the first Spider-Man game had an almost like odd devotion to the police, right? Like I'm pretty sure one of the main characters in the first game, like Yuri, was a member of the police, right?
Yeah.
And so it's very much like Spider-Man equals virtue equals working with police.
There's even
basically,
Spider Cop, right? Like that's the reoccurring bit.
Yeah. So it's like it's a very kind of idealistic in its vision of both Spider-Man and the police, right? And I think what's interesting about Spider-Man Miles Morales is the video game on PlayStation 4, PlayStation 5 is they do not replicate that dynamic. And I'll read a quote from the article here. Quote, where Peter Parker's game, the first Spider-Man game, framed the ground level police as his at times unwitting allies, Miles Morales goes out of its way to draw as much attention away from them as possible. It often feels as if the game's creative team understood that a story about an Afro-Puerto Rican teenager teaming up with New York cops would strike the wrong tone, especially in a year that's been defined by protests calling for police reform and abolition in response to the kind of institutional police brutality that's left countless innocent, unarmed black people and brown people murdered by law enforcement. But the more you play the new game, the more you see that its attempt to acknowledge our real-world realities only goes but so far. Ultimately, the game doesn't have the courage or desire to be honest about the way things are, end quote. Where I disagree with Charles Pulliam Moore's piece is I think my reading is that he wanted this piece to kind of weigh in on world events and say like, and kind of be an indictment of the police. There is a Black Lives Matter mural, so it does nod to that movement. And I think what he was looking for was like for this game to kind of acknowledge like, hey, there is systemic racial injustice and things like that. And I just think that is like beyond that is expecting a reasonable it's reasonable to expect that of video games. It's reasonable to expect games to take a strong political and moral stance, and we should continue doing that. But I didn't see that it would I would not have predicted it would happen with this game. This is a like mass market game, and the idea that this game would weigh in on this in a huge like full-throated way, it just would have broken with not only like what this company has done in the past in Insomniac games. Like Insomniac is not known for like political screeds, but just like the video game industry in general, I think just isn't super thoughtful about these types of issues. They go out of their way to not be thoughtful because thoughtfulness will create controversy, which on occasion can hurt sales. And so I don't know that it was like a realistic thing to expect that this game would have a really serious point of view about the police relationship. But I do think that how the game treats police is rather interesting because I agree with this piece's assessment that they're basically invisible, right? Like the game doesn't deal with them at all. And most of the kind of side quests that Miles Morales goes to solve are done in this app, right? Which is kind of a nod toward community policing. But what's interesting to me is like, was what's in this game really a reaction to what's happened in the last year? Like, video games take a long time to be made and completed. You know, like it's not like they can just turn on a dime and say like, oh, we got to like redo all this. Maybe they redid like all the police stuff in this game after George Floyd this year, but I don't know. That's it's just something I've been thinking about. Is like, was this game a reaction to what happened this year?
Mm.
So anyway, my answer to your question about like how this game deals with police is, I think it's interesting. It basically completely, it doesn't do a 180 when it comes to the original Spider-Man games relationship with police, which was like very what do you call it? You know,
Blue Lives Mattery.
I don't know about that, but like I was gonna say adoring, but that's not even quite
Yeah.
accurate. But just basically like that
Partnered.
Yeah, they're very like partners. Like that's not the case in this game, and I thought that was interesting. Did you have any reaction to that? Did you notice that when you played it the first time?
Well, I noticed how absent they were to a point that it's almost eerie. Like you feel like you're like, knowing the real world. And I live right next to Simi Valley, which is like police headquarters of the world. So, I might have more police activity than most places, but like, as someone who lived in New York, it was very strange to just not see police as present in this game, to the point that Miles is doing activities that like, it concerns me are being left to a superhero to fulfill.
Yeah.
Like
petty larceny. He's like foiling petty larceny or something like that, right?
Yeah, exactly. And of course there's the really ridiculous stuff like collecting people's pigeons again. Although this time the pigeons are now involved in like a grand scheme to rob the Daily Bugle, but I'll leave that for people to enjoy. But yeah, I mean, some of that stuff, like it was kind of concerning, and there's definitely a conversation, to be had about superheroes in general. There's this great idea of like the fascism of superheroes, because they are like the Uberman. They literally go beyond the law to enact justice how they see fit.
Yeah.
And
we don't talk about how fascist the concept of superheroes are in general, I think, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there are shows like The Boys and stuff like that
Correct.
get into that territory, but I think Marvel will dip into it now and again with things like Civil War and stuff like that. But they really, it depends on how postmodern they want to be. And
I mean, the Marvel films are like overwhelmingly a celebration of the concept of the superhero, I think, right? Like. So.
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, I think like wrinkles were added into the formula when in Civil War in a way that I didn't expect them to quite go with. But yes, I mean, like Endgame. If Endgame is the period at the end of the sentence, it's superheroes good.
It is not. It is not a repudiation of the concept of superheroes, Dan. I'm sorry.
No. Yeah, but I mean, you have Captain America knowingly hiding that his friend murdered another person's parents is interesting, although not really well tackled, and kind of brushed under the rug in lieu of saving the world. But to the Black Lives Matter mural, I mean, it goes beyond that even, because that's kind of the final reward in this game if you do all of the like side quests born of your phone, and you get a Black Lives Matter costume, and it's not called that, but it is delivered to you at the base of the Black Lives Matter mural, and it is the colors of the Black Lives Matter iconography. And I found that interesting, like that. I don't know. I mean, I just don't think they needed to make that statement, and to kind of end the final image of the kind of long-standing quest you're going on with that, I think is powerful in its own right, if not like enough to erase the bad taste of the police stuff from the first game.
Well, I'd recommend checking out this piece by Charles Pulliam more, and he acknowledges that part as well, and says like it's the game. While it does nod towards Black Lives Matter, I think you and I would both agree, Dan, does absolutely nothing to kind of tackle this idea of racial injustice at the hands of the police, right?
Oh,
Like,
100%. I mean, it's about the same as like all of the women in Endgame joining together to fight. Like it's just performative. You know, and like we might enjoy like some of that performative nature, but it is hollow.
yeah, and I think it's because like most mass market video games are not, and we should say this about like most Disney movies as well, are just not ready to take strong political stance in general. And that is a shame, but it is part of the engine of capitalism that we live in and continue to feed. So, and it doesn't go for all movies, doesn't go for all video games, but like just from my anecdotal observation, that's been the case. It's just also fascinating for me to imagine an alternate universe in which like it was the case where like there was the same dynamic with the cops in this game. Like it just would have been so poorly received. You know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
I feel like if this game Miles Morales was all about Miles Morales and the cops teaming up to solve crimes, like I think the reaction would be very negative right now, right, to the game. But that's not the case. So I think they kind of tried to thread this needle, and overall, I think they accomplished what they set out to do. So
I was just surprised that they didn't go into it thematically. I mean, there's the whole Gamergate thing, but in comics, there's this thing called Comicsgate, which I can't believe I'm talking about this right now. But, it's this idea that like politics have become far too overt in mainstream comics. And that is what's bringing mainstream comics down, and they're not selling as much anymore. Well, that's ignoring that there are a million new different ways to get your entertainment today than there was, back when comics originated. But, they think that the reason that comics aren't selling as well is this overt political stuff. And they'd rather that politics be handled like on a thematic nature. So you've got, Stan Lee used to do this all the time in his run of Spider-Man comics, where you'd have like Robbie Robertson at the Daily Bugle talking to his son about like how to get ahead in the world. And there were like, riots and protesting on Peter Parker's campus to kind of reflect the, nature of life in the 60s. But it would never like, insert Richard Nixon into the pages of the comics. Whereas today that you might find something like that. But like, it is strange to me that the themes of this story aren't even really about that in any way. Anyway, that's just my thought.
well, I mean, what would we say the themes of Spider-Man Miles Morales are? I think it echoes the idealistic vision of the first game, I think, right? Which is just that it's with great power comes great responsibility. Like one should seek to do good as much as is possible. One should seek to save as many lives as possible. One should not, in trying to stop evil, become evil. These kind of fairly basic and at this point kind of banal messages. But I say that it sounds like I'm dissing the game, but there is something to be enjoyed about the earnestness of it. There's very little media I consume these days that is really just earnest and optimistic. And this is a game I think that is earnest and optimistic. Wouldn't you say so?
Absolutely. And I think, it at times is at fault, where it just seems overly familiar. But then at other times it does that really smart Marvel thing where it goes really earnest, but then kind of acknowledges it with a joke here or there that allows you to kind of like lean into the earnestness of it and enjoy it. I would often find myself on the verge of an eye roll, and then they would make a joke about it, and I would go, "Oh, okay, they're aware," and it allowed me to kind of like lean into the kind of like a bright-eyed optimism of it all.
Yeah, and I kind of dig the idea that like, hey, anyone can be a hero, and it's up to you to help to solve the problems in your community, and like it's all just very like idealistic. Things can be better, and I didn't mind it. I didn't mind it because obviously we're living in a world that in which a lot of hope has been removed from us, right? So I appreciated that part of it. Shall we get into spoilers for the game? Anything else you want to say before we get into spoilers?
No, let's do it.
Yeah, let's talk about spoilers for the game. So the game introduces this colorful cast of characters. Krieger, this guy who like the first 30 seconds he's introduced, I'm like, this is going to be the ultimate bad guy. I mean, it feels like they weren't even trying. They weren't even trying to make him not seem evil from the start, right?
But then they pretty much forget about him.
Yeah, for most of the game, it seems, right?
What happened to Brendan Fraser? I wanted to see him.
Indeed. And I mean, the person who is the ultimate villain in the game is Finn. And I gotta say, a little bit mixed on the Finn arc, because you spend quite a bit of time, like, her being convinced that she has to destroy the entire world. And then she kind of has this, like, Martha from Batman versus Superman moment at the end of the game. Where she sees Miles like about to sacrifice himself to stop this reactor, and then she's like, "Wait, that's like the other person I knew that I loved who also did the same thing, and now I'm gonna be a good person again." Don't know if I quite found that satisfying. What did you think?
I just felt like the game really gave her a lot of room to be a character that was like morally gray and had a legitimate reason to do what she was doing. And you understood why Miles wanted to stop her. But at the same time, you kind of understood where she was coming from. But then I feel like the decision isn't really ultimately left up to her to make. The decision is made for her by the fact that there's something wrong with the wiring in the device that it's going to end up blowing up all of Harlem. And she just doesn't believe that because Miles has lied to her in the past, which I thought was a nice wrinkle, but I didn't really quite get like why that was such a hang up. So it feels like she goes from a character with a lot of agency to suddenly just being forced to be bad. And so the writers have to lean into that and write her that way. And the whole final battle with her,
because she's not fundamentally an evil person, is the thing, right? Like,
no,
she's trying to enact some version of justice, and the reason why she is framed as evil is because of what you said, which is like she made an error in her. It was an honest mistake that she made, right, in the calculation, And so it ultimately isn't necessarily a battle of ideas as much as it is a battle of like techniques, right?
Right. And I think there's a lot of missed opportunity, even just in the way that the game's like stages the battle, if you will, with her, the final battle. I mean, we're in this kind of like, we're in Roxxon Plaza, and it's just like this hall of mirrors and shiny things, which, don't get me wrong, looked amazing on my PlayStation 5. And I'll say in fidelity mode. And we had just come from, they spent all this time with us going through these like really slow narrative bits, which I felt like, it was really hard to play these narrative bits after playing Last of Us 2, which I know you're not a fan of, but I do feel like the scenes where that game slows down, there's always a really touching character arc that's subtly being done, and these just don't measure up to that at all.
I definitely got a Last of Us tingle during some scenes. I'm like, oh, this game is trying to pull like a Last of Us, and The Last of Us 2 does do that much better than this game.
And it doesn't help that this game is also in a museum with space stuff in it.
Yep.
But I felt like there was a real missed opportunity to stage the final battle between Miles and Finn in this rocks, or in the Osborn Space Center, where all of their memories were formed together. Like you could have them destroying space shuttles and their device that they worked so hard together on. And instead we're in just like boring,
generic
buildings.
Kind of.
And it's like, don't get me wrong. The art team, I feel like, did an incredible job on this game. Like I really came into this thinking, I didn't love the art style of the first game. the kind of like going for uncanny valley realism, especially when you get the Into the Spider-Verse suit in this game, where you're like, whoa, what kind of potential could there have been? But they really sold me on the art style by the end. But then I'm like, the storytellers just aren't doing anything with that.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like we're kind of crapping on the game and the ending a little bit, which we kind of are. I mean, I think that I had a great ride overall, but the ending felt a little bit underwhelming to me, just because. Yeah, as we said, there's not really like a big disagreement between these two fundamentally, right?
Yeah.
Like the reason they're fighting is because one of them doesn't understand something correctly.
Right.
Which, by the way, I should point out is kind of similar to the ending of Civil War as well, the Avengers or Captain America: Civil War. But on top of that, I just felt like her turn was like real fast,
Yeah. And real hard.
real fast, real hard, and then she comes in and saves the day, and is like, oh, another person who sacrificed themselves so that like Peter could learn a lesson. And it just is like it ended up being like a really tragic arc. And so the ending was a little bit anticlimactic, but I actually did quite enjoy the battle. I died several times on it. And I thought it was like, wow, this is actually like really hard fighting her at the end. Just in terms of the mechanics of like, she has this gigantic sword, she's launching missiles, she's launching like these spinning blades at you. It was a challenge. And I appreciated that. So
I agree with that, and I like the challenge of it. In terms of like getting back to my comment about the repetition of gameplay, I do feel like one of the struggles with this game is that there's a joy in how short and condensed it is, and how you can kind of just get through it. And that sounds like it's like a bad sit or whatever, but what I mean is like there's not padding, or there really shouldn't be padding. But at the same time, like I didn't feel like there were a ton of new ideas introduced, and that you can see that in the bosses. Like all the bosses come down to using your spider sense to dodge at the last second, and then whether it's trigger a venom blast or whatever. Like why wasn't there a boss where I had to go invisible and do like all kinds of, use my venom powers to, turn on motors, or maybe I'm fighting Electro and we're both electric guys. I just feel like there's so much more room for imagination. And as much as I enjoyed the final fight, it was like, well, I've done this with a different coat of paint on it throughout the rest of the game. I feel like the opening with Rhino is like one of the like more memorable things, where it evolves constantly into new things.
Right.
And I would love to see more of that throughout these games.
It feels like the game really peaked early, I'll say. Right.
Oh,
like,
yeah.
That is like one of the most exhilarating fights of the game. And nothing in the rest of the game ever really matches up to it, in my opinion. Just in terms of the thrill of it. You know what I mean?
Oh, for sure. Like even just like, I can't wait for the next one, because that opening scene has 2 Spider-Men in it. So like, it's so fun to be doing your thing and see Peter flipping around, making jokes and pulling the train up for you to go under. I mean, it was a real thrill to be in the midst of all of that chaos, and feel like you had some hand in controlling it. That I found really thrilling. And while we're on something positive, because I did have a good time with this game, but as always, I want to use this opportunity to push them forward. The same way that you were saying about that, police article, you can criticize something without destroying it. But I loved how they couched the design of Miles's suit in this game, that the V cut red on the black suit was modeled after the Puerto Rican flag. That is not from the comics or anywhere. And I thought, what a beautiful thing to kind of, I'll always carry that with me when I look at Miles from now on. Like, it's a reflection of his heritage in some way. And it's like, wow, what a happy accident.
Random observation about the suits. I love the variety of the suits, and I love that you can choose which one, but some of the suits are very weird and silly. You know,
Mm-hmm.
like there's one where you're like wearing a scarf and stuff, and there's one where you look like a giant cyborg and stuff. And sometimes it's just weird when you're like in a fairly mundane situation wearing like a wild suit, and everyone's like treating you like you're a normal person. You know, there is this kind of dissonance on occasion. This not even ludonarrative dissonance necessarily, but just like people are treating you like they wouldn't necessarily be treating you because you chose a different skin. But anyway, I do like the variety of the suits, and as you indicated, I did have a great time with the game. I think it's a lot of fun, and even if it is much of the same, you know, the same was actually really enjoyable the first time around. I looking back on it though, now you're making me reconsider a lot of things. You're making me think, oh yeah, you're right. There were a lot of missed opportunities. Now that you mention it, Dan.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
I just think like, from a gameplay point of view, like how many rooms do I have to go in and beat up guys? But like you could change up that formula, pretty easily. Like say like, hey, in this room the floor is electrocuted, so you can only take guys out from above or whatever. But I never felt like the
yeah,
challenge was varied, at all. It was, and half the time I just spent silently stealthing people. But even that, it's like there's no real reward for doing things stealthily
yeah.
in that regard. Like typically, I could just run into the room, beat everybody up, no problem. And I guess it comes down to like skill or whatever. I'm not trying to say I'm good at this game or anything like that, but yeah.
I also wonder, just like, this is a game that came out in the middle of a pandemic. I wonder like if there were things that they couldn't execute on because of the pandemic. I don't know. But maybe there were versions of that in previous renditions of the game, and they're just like, nope, we can't realistically do it. Like, we need to ship a simpler version of this. Because I would say, as you indicated, like the first game did have a much wider variety of missions, right? So
Whether you like them or not, they
yeah,
really tried to change it up. And I think that's also, maybe part of the short nature of this game is like they're so busy teaching you how to play the game. Like you're getting new moves and new things all the time,
right. Up
but
until the end, yeah,
right, but you don't have the ability in that short period of time to go in depth and really change it up all that much, right? When you're playing a Mario game, the first 10 levels typically cover the basics that you see in every Mario game, but it's only much later on in the special worlds and stuff where they really get to go crazy because they know that you've had time to master it. But in something as short as this, I think that maybe they feel a little more like, handcuffed about what they can really truly do. So I'm excited, hopefully, that we get some DLC and maybe they go a little wilder in that.
yeah, maybe. I don't know though. I wasn't super impressed by the DLC in the first game, I have to say.
No, I agree with you, but they did things like there's that Black Cat mission where you're in the painting gallery and you have to stop the people from stealing the paintings.
Yeah, that
Um,
was cool.
right. So like that's a place where you start kind of shaking up the core gameplay and do new things with it. So I would be much more interested if things like that were happening rather than just giving me new suits.
Indeed. All right. Well, we had a great time. There is some room for improvement in the game, though. But uh, overall, like, how did you feel about the story that this told about Miles Morales?
I liked it. I mean, I think it's fairly basic, but it's really well told. The characters are warm. Every time someone piped in over my speakers or talked to me while I was swinging around, I wanted to hear what they had to say because I like these people.
Yeah, they're cool characters.
Yeah.
I kind of wish there was a little bit more about like the relationship between him and his mom.
Yes.
Because theoretically, his mom is somebody who has lost her husband, who was a police officer and like was a crime fighter, and like so you'd think that would influence her wanting to be protective of him in some way, and uh, that relationship was really given short shrift. I think you're right. It is a function of the length. I think the Spider-Man game was like twice or three times as long as this game, right? So you really had time to kind of delve into themes like that. Whereas this game is really just like, oh, we got to introduce all these characters, and here are all the moves, and here's the main villain, and now you're done. Like that's basically kind of the pace of this game.
The same is true with like the Prowler character, who I think is given very little real depth. We don't really ever find out what went on between Jefferson, the problematically named Jefferson Davis, and his brother Aaron Davis. And so that felt, although I liked the Prowler boss battle, the visual of that, but yeah, I would love to see this world continue to be fleshed out, whether that be in DLC or in the sequel. I did miss having Jonah pipe in constantly. I thought the Danny cast for how kind of like positive and youthful it wasn't quite as enjoyable as hearing Jonah be irascible, but
I appreciated the break from Jonah, to be honest.
I will say
I've heard enough of incredibly Alex Jones types characters like being thrust in my ears all the time.
I guess that's true. I do like that they leaned into the Alex Jonesness of it and had him hawking terrible products in this game. Excellent. I thought that was clever. I will say the Danny cast in this game in the comics is called Spider Talk. And the guy who wrote it acknowledged that it was influenced by my show, and that maybe the character Danny is named after myself.
What?
Yeah.
What? Are you serious?
I don't have it like 100%, but I wrote to him, and he sent me back a big smiley face image. So
you are the reason why the podcast that Miles Morales listens to is called the Danny Cast.
It could be, because in the comics it's called Spider Talk, which is the name of my show. So I guess they changed it. I was a little bit like, hey, I wanted Spider Talk to appear in the game, if only to get me some more clicks.
Why do you think they didn't call it Spider Talk?
They just wanted to slight me, but that's fine.
Well, I guess also because they like Spider Talk kind of limits it in a way as to what she can talk about in the game, right?
Yeah, that was my thought. I just think that they must respect my show so much that they decided, we'll let him have his space. We don't dare tread on his hollow ground.
I mean, it's also like they're afraid of you. Like they don't want to. They don't want you to sue their ass, right?
Yes, that's right. That's right, David. Because I would sue Marvel over me
for using the name of your podcast.
Right, exactly. Which is definitely not attributed to their comics in any way.
No, it has nothing to do with them at all.
Of course.
You don't discuss their copyrighted material at length at all in your podcast.
No, never.
Okay. Well, Dan Gvozden, it's been a pleasure chatting with you about this video game, Spider-Man Miles Morales, or I think it's Marvel's Spider-Man Miles Morales is the technical name. You can check Dan Gvozden out at the Amazing Spider Talk podcast, which is available wherever podcasts can be downloaded. And Dan, you're also on Twitter, right?
I am on Twitter. I'm at @SupSpiderTalk.
All right. Check him out there as well. And thank you so much for listening to this episode of Culturally Relevant, or wherever you're listening to this feed. We hope wherever you are, whatever you're doing these days, you're staying safe, staying healthy, and most importantly, staying at home and not traveling during the Thanksgiving holiday, because if you do, it's going to be a rough winter for a lot of people, and we don't want you to be part of that. So anyway, you can find more episodes of this podcast at culturallyrelevantshow.com and email me at culturallyrelevantshow@gmail.com. Follow this podcast on Twitter at CRevShow. That's CREVSHOW. This podcast was powered by Simplecast. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.